climate change is a global problem, but it's not even around the globe. So this dark red blotch here over the Himalayas shows the IPCC predicting that the Himalayas will warm faster than the global mean. And alpine vegetation, which in the Himalayas shows particular endemism and threat from climate change, is really at risk on account of this. Alpine vegetation is threatened both by direct temperature stresses as plants grow at temperatures and at precipitation levels, as some previous speakers mentioned, that they're not used to. But they're also threatened by competition from lower elevation species. As temperatures warm at these cold, high elevations, we predict that low elevation species will move up into the alpine area, and they'll start out-competing unique endemic alpine species that are really only found here in this area. In addition, climate change effects on plants interact with changes in land use and changes in harvest pressures that some other speakers have also mentioned to form a synchronized problem. When we combine this with the observation that Himalayan alpine vegetation is often very intensively used by Himalayan rural communities, it's clear that this area needs a lot of documentation. We've seen some of that documentation already today. But it also offers a chance to look at dynamic knowledge change. Traditional practices and knowledge sets can adapt and have to adapt to a changing world. So I don't have a lot of time, but I just wanted to take a few minutes today to quickly introduce one way that we're investigating that problem from the Missouri Botanical Garden in collaboration with institutions currently in Himalayan China, in Yunnan province, in Nepal, and in Bhutan. And you can see one major gap currently in the network that we helped to organize is northeastern India. So at each of these sites, we have mountain summits along an elevational gradient. They range from the lower alpine, subalpine ecotone up to the nival ecotone, so the limit of plant life currently. So in our areas, this is roughly between 4,000 and 5,000 meters above sea level. And we monitor temperatures here in these sites with buried temperature loggers. We compile plant lists for these summit area sections around the summits. And we conduct really intensive surveys of plant presence and abundance in 16 1-meter square plots. Now this is not a lot of meters, right? 16 square meters is not a lot for people who work in forest ecosystems, but in the alpine, this can represent hundreds of plant species. And importantly, this study is designed so that every 7 years we return to repeat the exact same methods and gather data that lets us assess the exact dynamics of climate change and its impact on these unique alpine species. So we're currently in the midst of completing our first resurvey after only 7 years, but this is supposed to be a methodology that's designed that we can return after 14 years, 21 years, 77 years, and really affect long-term monitoring that matches the long-term scale of climate change. And this network is also part of a globally shared methodology that's now implemented at 127 sites in virtually every major mountain region across the world. So what this lets us do is then extrapolate beyond just the regional trends that we see in one site or in the Himalaya, and ask whether the same effects are happening to alpine plants in the Andes or in the Alps or the Rockies or across the world. So to the basic ecological methods that are shared by all these groups working across the world, what we add to this is rural perspectives, ethnobotany. So these include ethnobotanical interviews and working with, written pharmacopoeia to assess the known uses of plants that we encounter in our surveys. Also working more broadly with participatory methods, like making maps and calendars with rural people, eliciting conversations in our summit areas about how land use has changed with repeat photographs and other old photographs, and other ways to assess the ways that climate change is affecting Himalayan rural people's understandings of the interactions with the alpine environment. So although the areas we work in have a really distinct flora and distinct cultures, of course, there are a lot of similarities and a lot of overlaps in the useful alpine species. So these are some of the more colorful ones. Mechanopsis horridula, the blue poppy that we heard mentioned before from Arunachal Pradesh, but also micro willow species, Polygonatum or Bistorta, and Cyanopodophyllum or Podophyllum are common and commonly used across these areas. These are just a few of several hundred species. And this is what some of the resurvey data looks like when we come back to these sites after 7 years. So this is data from 3 of the Chinese sites, the first ones that we resurveyed. And you can see that the changes in the plot are subtle. Here's one plot photographed in 2005 and 2012. In accord with the temperature increases that each site have seen, we've seen an increase in richness, so number of plant species, an increase in plant frequency, and an increase in useful plants. So we were initially surprised by this, but then we saw that we're also finding alpine areas becoming more similar to subalpine. So this is what's called thermophilization, as lower elevation plants move up into the alpine areas. And so although there's a short-term, perhaps positive effect of climate change on alpine species, we predict a long-term negative effect. However, even with this short-term positive effect, when we talk to rural Himalayan communities, they're observing traditionally used and marketed medicinal and aromatic plants becoming harder to find, alpine pastures declining, and there's increasing unpredictability, as Pasang and Chering mentioned earlier this morning. This unpredictability makes the environment hard to work with. But people are adapting. They're experimenting with new crops and new varieties. And we're trying to support efforts as people move towards cultivation rather than wild collection of some of these species. And also experiments with new sustainable collection strategies that allow plant populations to survive. Finally, to talk about some paths forward for our research, really, as much as for anyone else, we really want to continue to have our rural perceptions informing the ecological work we do. So although I'm an ethnobotanist, I really am primarily an ecologist, but I want this work to be informed by rural perspectives. And I was really intrigued by that presentation on human-centered design, because I think that this is the same sort of thing. The ecological method should also have human-centered design. Or as Shu says, co-production of hybrid knowledge. We also want to build capacity so that this long-term monitoring can really go on long-term. It has to take effect from the communities themselves. And of course, ultimately, we really want to support rural adaptation here so that people can adapt and adapt in healthy ways that also allow the environment to be sustained. Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to have to request all the other speakers to please take up only 5 minutes each. We're majorly running out of time. Thank you.
In fact, I must express my gratitude to the Balipara Foundation for giving me the opportunity to speak before you. And I will in fact speak on climate change impacts and challenges with reference to Eastern Himalayas. In fact, about the climate change, I think it is needless to tell here that it is a global problem, and it has no climate, as you know, does not have any boundary, and whether the climate change takes place in the Eastern Himalaya or in other parts of the region, it is more or less the same. But a key driver of the climate change, what are the causes of the climate change? Globally, it has been, it is well known that it is basically the greenhouse gases which are the key driver of the climate change, and then these greenhouse gases are emitted to the atmosphere primarily due to the anthropogenic activities, and amongst them, the fossil fuel burning, the land use, land pattern change, and then your agricultural activities and urbanization and so on and so forth. So these are the, and of course another very important issue is the widespread deforestation is another major cause of more emission of the greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the Eastern Himalayas, I will not go into the detail of the Eastern Himalayas because of the paucity of the time. I have been told the 5 minutes time. So in the Eastern Himalayas, including the Northeast, the major issue related to climate change is the shifting cultivation, which we call as a biomass burning, or in that slash and burn, or as a, practicing the zoom cultivation. So this is a very important issue to be addressed. It's creating a concern for for the climate change, more primarily for the release of the trace gases into the atmosphere. So this is, in fact, the map, which is not necessary. And the vulnerability is, as a part of Eastern Himalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, my species, I will be talking mostly on related to Arunachal Pradesh, which is the biggest state of Northeast and is a part of the Eastern Himalaya. As a part of Eastern Himalaya, Arunachal Pradesh is rich in threatened, endangered, and endemic floral faunal species with restricted distributions and narrow habitat ranges that are at particular risk due to climate change. So those endangered plants and threatened plants are at a very vulnerable stage, and they're at a risk due to climate change. Some flora like Amentotaxus assamica, Gladitistia assamica, Coptistita, etc. Some important plant species which are vulnerable to climate change, and the fauna like snow leopard, red panda, Asian elephant are in vulnerable condition due to climate change. And then species like flying squirrel, takin, white-winged wood duck, missimi, wren, etc. are more vulnerable to climate change. And this is a very important issue. I have told you the shifting cultivation, that the burning of biomass is a concern for climate change. When you burn large scale biomass in the form of the shifting cultivation in the northeastern hill states, then we find that the associated emission of the aerosols as well as the trace gases which are released into the atmosphere, and it has been found that they play a vital role. These trace gases in the atmosphere as well as the aerosols, they play a vital role for changing the cloud pattern, and then also causing the atmospheric perturbation and ultimately the climate change. A significant correlation has been obtained from the study that have been done in the northeastern region hill states, particularly Arunachal Pradesh as well as the Mizoram, but I am showing the data on the Arunachal Pradesh that there is a correlation between the amount of aerosols released and with the intensity of the fire or intensity of burning of the biomass due to shifting cultivation, more particularly in the month of March and April, because March and April, there is large incidence of forest fire burning, and then it has been reported that this has got positive correlation with the quantity of the aerosol burning, aerosol present in the atmosphere, as well as the intensity of the fire, and that is particularly has been reported in the month of March and April. This has been done with GIS study by Indian Remote Sensing Agency and the National Physical Laboratory, New Delhi, and to which the Tezpur University is also part of this study. And for future studies for better understanding of climate change impacts and adaptation. For climate change impact and climate change mitigation or adaptation, we need to have the precise emission of greenhouse gases, primarily methane and nitrous oxide. And in fact, carbon dioxide also is a greenhouse gas, but carbon dioxide is in forest, it is a sink of, forest can act as a sink of carbon dioxide, and that is how much of carbon dioxide a forest can sequester. That is more important. And we at the Tezpur University have been doing work on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon sequestration for a very long period of time. And we have developed some technologies for mitigation of the greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, particularly emitted from anthropogenic sources. And we have a recent publication in Journal of Cleaner Production in 2017 has come on particularly nitrous oxide emission reduction from agricultural sources. As far as the carbon dioxide concentration is concerned, is in a forest ecosystem, as I have said, that forest can act as a sink. And we are also working in this carbon sequestration study, and particularly of course in Assam, not in Eastern Himalaya, but in Kaziranga, you can see that tower has got a good number of sensors fixed on the tower, and by eddy covariance method we are estimating amount of the carbon dioxide, CO2 flux we are estimating, and all the meteorological parameters associated with CO2 flux that we are measuring. And then you can see in the ground that is soil CO2 flux instrument by which we are measuring the carbon released from the soil. So how much of carbon is released from the soil, how much of carbon is fixed by the plant by photosynthesis, and how much of carbon is released by the plant in the form of respiration. The total dynamics have been worked out. And if you have a total dynamics, then you can say that this forest is sequestering so much of carbon per year. So in fact, in the Eastern Himalayas, it is very rich in forest ecosystem. So in such type of work can be done in the Eastern Himalayas so as to say that how much of carbon actually a forest has sequestered in by a particular forest ecosystem. Apart from that, quantification of trace gas emissions due to forest fire need to be done. How much of a detailed analysis of the trace gas emissions like NOx, SOx, etc. And then phenology of flowering plants at different altitudes need to be done. That phenology is the behavior of the plant for flowering. All the angiosperms, all the flowering plants are sensitive to the photoperiod, sensitive to the temperature. So if there is a change in temperature, then obviously the flowering behavior of these plants will be very much affected, and then hydrological study at different altitudes need to be worked out. So this is the altitudinal zonation and forest type of Arunachal Pradesh, a major Eastern Himalayan area. So you can see in a different altitude, different type of forest at the high altitude alpine forest, the next temperate zone, subtropical zone, and tropical zone. So in these different zones, we have got different type of flowering plants. So their phenology need to be worked out. That this particular altitude, how many days a flowering plant has taken for flowering. So that will give us, if there is change in temperature, even plus minus 1 degree centigrade change in temperature, that will affect the flowering behavior of the plant. By that we can, by that type of study, by phenological study, we can have a good picture of the impact of change in temperature at different altitudes, how flowering behavior are being changed. Then strategies for mitigation. For studies on the phenology of some specific species can be carried to monitor the trend of climate change within the state. Most organisms found in this area are confined to specific habitats such as high altitude, dense forest, and most of them are very sensitive to climate change, and their phenology have been being affected. So some taxa such as Coptistita, ginseng species, Elysium species, and rhododendron, etc., can be used to address phenological monitoring program on climate change. So any climate change work, impact of climate change, so these particular plant species can be used for monitoring the impact of climate change. If the flowering behavior has changed, then we can definitely say there is change in the temperature behavior. There is change in the temperature, or there may be increase in the temperature, and that is why the flowering behavior of these plants have been said. On my personal communication with the Rajiv Gandhi University scientists, have found that the rhododendron flowering behavior have been said to be changed, but I don't have any scientific information on that. So in conclusion, the existing pressure like habitat loss, deforestation, clear felling, and overexploitation amplify the impact of climate change on the biodiversity. Management initiatives should be taken for mitigating the climate change. Need for some intensive research work to be carried out through coordinated project in this area to assess the trend of climate change and possible mitigation strategies. So this, in fact, the research on climate change in Eastern Himalaya, it is in fact need to be done in a coordinated manner, multi-institutional work. It should be multi-institutional work, not that only one institute will be able to do that. But if the research work is done in a coordinated manner in the form of a coordinated project, I think we can definitely come out with some mitigation strategy, and we can come out with the intensity of the damage caused by climate change and how to mitigate that, and how to go for adaptation study of the vegetation, flora and fauna in the Eastern Himalayas. So it should be a coordinated project, not a single. We alone cannot do that in one particular university or one particular laboratory, but it should be a coordinated effort. So these are the some of the references which I have actually consulted to make this presentation before you. And then thank you very much for your patient sharing. And I again thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak before the galaxy of the scholars present here. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I am Manish. I am a PhD student at ATRI, and I'll be presenting my work on looking at understanding rainfall in Sikkim Himalaya. If I have the presentation. Yep, thank you. So as we know, with rising temperatures, we are also observing a lot of problems of water scarcity as well as access, and how climate change is going to affect global water cycle is a question of utmost importance. Globally, it's predicted that with climate change, there will be intensification of a hydrologic cycle, which means there's more evaporation, more precipitation. But the extent and magnitude, especially the spatial extent, is very difficult to model in case of rainfall, especially in complex elevational gradients, because rainfall doesn't correlate with elevation as good as temperature does. There are very few studies from pantropical mountains like Himalayas, and that's where my study is going to locate itself. This is a very small part of the larger study that we are looking at. We have a number of ground observation of rainfall, and we are trying to, but as we know that there are very little number of spatially explicit ground observations from Himalayas. We have some rain gauges, but these are located for very small duration. In this case, gridded rainfall products, especially products which are made from either interpolation of existing rain gauge data or from satellite-derived products, act as useful substitute, but require careful validation and correction before usage. I'll be using one product here, which is from Indian Meteorological Department, MD. It's available at a daily resolution at a spatial resolution of 0.25 degrees, which is roughly 700 square kilometers. It's the longest data set available for India from 1901 to 2016. And as you can see the spatial map, which is mean annual rainfall figure here. The dots are the rain gauges that we have. I'll be focusing on 4 parameters: mean annual rainfall, number of rainy days in a year, which is basically an extent of how the rainfall is spread, number of large storm events, which is basically cumulative 5-day maximum rainfall, and looking at how different rainfall intensities are faring here. As a caveat, IMD is showing very high rainfall in the Trans-Himalayan region, which is very unlikely, and it is something that we are looking at carefully. So the results should be taken with a pinch of salt, of course. Looking at mean annual rainfall, what we can see very clearly is that there is a multi-decadal cycle that is evident, which with a duration of roughly 25 to 30 years. And in the recent years, there has been a decline from 1975 onwards, which probably is fueling the perception of rainfall decline in the region, but it's actually a part of the trough of the larger multi-decadal cycle. When we looked at the long-term trend, which is the sense slope is an estimate of long-term trend in a data set, and what we are looking at is that especially in mid to high elevation, there is a decline in rainfall. This decline is mostly concentrated in West and North Sikkim region when we look at it spatially. When we look at number of rainy days in a year, there is very clearly the number of rainy days have increased in the last quadrant. This is mostly when you look at spatially, and these are the graphs from spatial rainfall for 30-year packages from 1900 to 2016. And when you look at the last quadrant, this part of the North Sikkim region, that's where the most of the increase in number of rainy days has happened, which is basically the mid and high elevation region in Sikkim. When you look at large storm events, basically continuous 5-day rainfall, it shows a decline in the last quadrant, and that decline again is concentrated in the North Sikkim region. Alternatively, you can see at the bottom, in the South Sikkim region, there's an intensification in the last quadrant. So the number of large events seems to have increased in the Southeast Sikkim region, which has implications for landslide and flash flood generation and other biophysical factors. Looking at different rainfall intensities, we have categorized into 4 categories, basically less than 25 mm low rainfall, 50 mm medium rainfall, greater than 100 mm high rainfall, and greater than 150 mm very high rainfall intensities. The low and medium intensity rainfall seems to have declined over the last 1960 onwards at least, whereas the number of events in high and very high category seems to have increased in the recent decades. When we look at it spatially, especially the large events or the high intensity events from greater than 100 and greater than 150 mm, Most of this result in the last quartet is focused around South and Southeast Sikkim region, it seems. But does it mean, basically it means that the number of events have increased in the number of events have increased in the recent quartet, but does it mean that these events are more stronger, or these are very high cloudburst events of sort? For this, we looked at maximum daily rainfall across years, and what it shows is that essentially there's a decline in maximum daily rainfall, which means that although the number of events have increased, the high rainfall intensity events have increased, these events are not very, very big events. These are not the cloudburst events in this region. So in summary, what we are seeing is there is a multi-decadal pattern. In terms of result summary, the annual rainfall is decreasing, but the number of rainy days have increased. So the rainfall is more spread out, which kind of softens the overall effect of the rainfall. Number of large storms have decreased. Number of low or mid-intensity rainfall events have also decreased, but the events in high or very high category, daily rainfall intensities have increased. But the maximum daily rainfall has decreased again, as we've seen earlier. Most of these changes are in mid to high elevation region, concentrated around West and North Sikkim region, and especially South Sikkim region, we are seeing high intensity rainfall, which has implication for landslide, flash floods, as well as other biogeographical effects. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Shweta. I'll be talking about my research on flowering phenology of rhododendrons in Sikkim Himalaya. Slide. So what is flowering phenology? Flowering phenology is a study which addresses the timing of recurring biological events of plants, such as bud formation, flowering, and fruiting. It gets important to understand what drives the flowering events in plant communities. It seemed that these plants synchronize their phenological events with the peak availability of abiotic resources, such as temperature, precipitation, day length, etc., and the biotic resources, such as pollinators or even seed dispersers. However, these kind of events are also constrained by the evolutionary history of species, where the closely related species tend to flower or fruit during a similar timing, a common phenomenon known as phylogenetic conservatism. I'm interested in understanding the phenological events of high-altitude plant communities, where the species are exposed to very harsh environmental conditions, like extremely low temperatures, heavy snowfall, when the snow covers the surface for almost 4 to 5 months. Hence, it provides these flowering plants with a very short window to complete its phenological events. Overall, it provides these species, making the species very vulnerable to the future warming scenario. Phenology is also considered as a good predictor of climate change. However, there is a lack of long-term monitoring of phenology from these reasons. But a study designed on phenology across the elevation gradient can help us understand how the phenological events are responding to the variation in the climatic variables. So through my study, I'm trying to understand the influence of abiotic factors and phylogenetic constraint on flowering phenology of rhododendrons in the high altitude of Sikkim Himalaya. Rhododendron is one of the dominant plant community of the high altitudes. It's also recognized as a keystone species. The flowering of rhododendrons attracts a lot of tourists, generating a lot of revenue for government. It also has a high economic and ethnic values. My study was carried out in Kengusla Alpine Sanctuary, which covered an elevation gradient of 3,200 meter to 4,200 meter. So through my first question, I'm trying to understand, is there a phylogenetic signaling in the peak budding, flowering, and fruiting and fruition events among rhododendron species? To understand this, I selected species by laying 27 vegetation plots across the elevation gradient. Phenology monitoring was done at every 15 days interval, and the sampling duration was for 3 years. We constructed a larger phylogeny for the rhododendron species and further pruned the tree for the species of our interest. And we tested for phylogenetic signaling using Bloomberg scale and Paget's lambda. The results showed that the earlier flowering events, such as the budding peak, flowering peak, and fruiting peak, seem to have phylogenetic signaling across species, meaning the closely related species tend to bud, flower, or fruit during a similar timing. I'll explain it further with the help of one trait, the peak flowering. So the color gradient here indicates the variation in its flower timing. These are the first 3 species to flower during the month of early May, followed by the other 3 species which flowered in between mid of May to mid of June. And these are the last 4 species which flowered in between mid of June to mid of July. As explained earlier, the species are also exposed to very harsh environmental conditions, which makes it immensely important to understand how climatic variables predict the flowering events in rhododendron species. I used generalized linear model to test this, where my response was bi-monthly mean day of a year, where my predictors were day length, temperature, rainfall, and elevation. The results showed that for the early phenological events, such as the budding peak and flowering peak, were better explained by temperature, whereas the later events like fruiting peak and fruit dehiscent peak were explained more by the day length. Through my third question, we are trying to understand how abiotic factors and phylogeny interactively predict the flowering events in rhododendron species. So we built 2 models, linear model where we consider just the abiotic factors, phylogenetic generalized least square where apart from the abiotic factors, we also consider the evolutionary history of a species. And similar response and predictors were used. The results showed that in case of budding peak and the fruiting peak, both of these 2 models were equally able to explain, which means abiotic factors alone are also able to explain these phenological events, whereas in case of a flowering peak and fruit dehiscent peaks, it was the linear model which just had the abiotic factors were better able to explain these events. So I conclude that there is a strong phylogenetic signaling across species for budding, flowering, and fruiting events. However, the abiotic factors alone can strongly predict the phenological events in comparison to the evolutionary history. The sensitivity of budding and fruiting events to temperature indicates that this species might get affected by the future warming. Thank you.
So my name is Kamal Pandya. I represent GMS. And the subject which has been assigned to me is the relationship between climate change and mining. Why? Because GMS is engaged in the business of consulting for mining. Now, let me begin by saying, as Indigo says, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, there are 2 reasons. One, after this session, I think we'll all fly away. And the second one is that there is a lesson for the boys and girls of today, whom I see right here. So let me begin. I have very limited 7 points, and which I'll use to draw attention between climate change and mining. They both have a relationship, both difficult and vast. I would attempt to bring out 2 key elements which you'll realize towards the end of my speed talk. Number 2 is human intervention and environment degradation result in climate change. Now it's a vicious circle. So mining disrupts, and greedy mining is a disaster. In India, we have enough rules, enough laws, frameworks, and legislations. They are not only to sustain through sustainable mining activity, but also to mitigate to some extent in case the damage has been done. So, if we can follow all laws, it shall sustain, since mining cannot have a 0 footprint. Therefore, under the laws of the land, we have a mining plan, we have an environment impact assessment, I'm sure all of you are aware. We have an environment management plan, and everything tells us whether you do open cast mining, underground mining, or bored pillar method. So everything is scientifically defined. To ensure that it is safe mining with due regard to socio-economic factors, to protect forests, differentiate between no-go areas or go areas. So to sustain water bodies and rivers, to limit pollution, and to protect flora and fauna. If we follow all this, it leads to sustainable and scientific mining. If we follow the rules, there are no problems. There's no degradation. Of course, there is mining is a disruptive activity, but then it will be near zero footprint. The laws in India are no different from what exists in mature mining economies. The Indian laws today, as it stands, they trust the miner with quality implementation based on self-declarations. So the government trusts you, provided you follow the rules. Now, whether it is MMDR, MCR, or the IBM rules, etc., etc. But you need to follow it to the last T. The problem is of quality implementation. And two actions limit this. One is honest implementation, and second is our habit of taking shortcuts. So when I started, I said, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. So here's a story for the boys and girls. In a very deep forest, many years ago, the story is picked up from Panchtantra, which is by Vishnu Sarman. He wrote many centuries ago, maybe 5,000 years ago. And it was meant for the royal princes who were given lessons in statesmanship through stories on animals, birds, the common folklore. So this story says there was a flock of birds deep in the forest. I don't know how many of you have read Panchtantra and know about the story. This flock of birds, they used to sing, dance, full of joy. They used to chirp all the time. In the deep forest, there was this village, and there was a villager. This guy, he used to breed worms. And in ancient India, there used to be a barter system. So he used to go to a local hut. He would sell the worms and buy feathers to make quilts, pillows, etc. So one day while he was passing through the forest, one of the birds from the flock of birds said, "What's in this?" He says, "Worms." "So many?" Yeah, I go and sell it and buy feathers. So do one thing. You give us the worms, which we'll eat. We can survive on it. And all of us, this flock, will give you few feathers every day. Okay. So there was a catch. So this villager spoke to the king or the queen of the flock of birds, and they agreed. And there was this unwritten contract. This guy would breed the worms, get this full basket, bring it to that clearing in the forest. The birds would come, they would eat the worms and pluck few flowers and give it to this villager. The villager was also very healthy and very joyous, very fine. He used to walk up to the hut, kept his health well. So what he used to do was breed worms, walk a few 10 steps, come to the clearing, the birds would take away, and this went on and on. Until, now start imagining things. Panchtantra is about imagination. The birds started losing more feathers than they could grow. And this villager, who used to exercise every day, walk 10 kilometers to sell his worms and buy feathers through barter, he became a little fat, plumpy. And one fine day, all the birds had no feathers. And the villager became obese and he couldn't walk. The other birds, they were like frightful of this flock of birds because they had no feathers. And they stopped singing. And they stopped being joyous. And they stopped being happy. And the villager himself, he was bedridden. Now, what's the moral of the story and how is it linked to mining? I talked about being honest and taking no shortcuts, and that's why I said boys and girls. The same is true. Same is true with mining when we disregard nature and we take shortcuts. But imagine how these two parties reversed nature by intervening in each other's lives. They were not honest about it. And they intervened to take a shortcut for a small gain. So when we are talking about climate change, we are talking about various other industrial activities or business activities. If we try and take these shortcuts, or if we are not honest to ourselves, the government has made rules. If we follow it to the last T, nothing will go wrong. And our rules, laws, legislation, framework, everything is at par with all international standards. I mean, there are great companies doing mining in India. You can't fault them. And they take pride in engaging in mining in the way they do. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, no shortcuts. Thank you very much.